Welcome back. In this video, we're going to start looking at the two tools that we're going to be using to manage Exchange 2007. The first of these is the Exchange Management Console, and that's what we're going to be looking at right now. In the next video, we'll be looking at the Exchange Management Shell, which is the command line and scripting way of doing Exchange management. First, we're going to spend some time getting to know the graphical user interface, or the GUI, of the console. And in this video, we're going to be looking first at the console layout, knowing what it is you're looking at and how to get around, where to look to get tasks done. Then after that quick look, we're going to go into architecture and talk about what's actually happening when we use either the Exchange Management Console or the Exchange Management Shell to get things done. Where are those changes actually taking place? Once we've covered that, we'll look at role delegation, how to give people jobs to do within Exchange, whether it's server administration or taking care of users, creating mailboxes, or even setting settings that are going to apply organization-wide. How do you separate out those roles and do it in an easy way that's not that complicated? Once we've covered that, we'll actually go on a grand tour where I'll take you through most of the different areas of the Exchange Management Console, and we'll actually, on the way, take care of some of those finalization tasks that we left undone after the last video and get a few things done, be on our way to having a functioning mail server there. To close up, we'll cover two more topics: the Toolbox, some important tools for disaster recovery and monitoring in there. And we'll also go to the Exchange website and take a look at what extras are available for download. Really things you can consider as additions to your basic toolbox. And lastly, we'll look at the 32-bit edition of Exchange 2007. Yes, I said a 32-bit edition. We'll look at how to get it, what it's useful for, what its limitations are. So let's go ahead and get started with the EMC layout. So here we go. We're going to be looking at this console in a second, but just before we get there, I'm going to point out that when you see it, there's going to be three work panes. There's the console tree pane on the left, and in this pane, as you'll see in a sec, it's only a two-level hierarchy. You don't have to drill down through 6 levels of folders and containers like you do in the Active Directory or even in Exchange 2003 to get to things. Only 2 levels. Once you click on an item, you end up seeing a bunch of options for areas of configuration in the work pane. And then depending on which option you've picked or which component you've picked in the work pane, you'll see your actions change on the right. So the goal with this arrangement was to kind of bring as many things up in the interface as possible so that you have fewer things buried down deep where you can't find them when you need them. Right, let's go ahead and take a look at that and open up the interface. So we'll jump back onto our server and log in and open up the Exchange Management Console. First thing I'm going to want to point out when we look in the console is how the console's pretty much been divided up into 3 different spheres of influence. The first sphere that we'll look at, as soon as it comes up here, is the organizational sphere. Now, as you can imagine, the differences are between organization, server, and recipient. We're moving from a global kind of level of configuration down to configuration in a specific server, and then down to configuration of a specific recipient or mailbox. So organizational settings, anything you set here will apply to all servers in the organization that have the roles that are listed underneath organization. And basically we're only given settings here that will affect all the systems. So if I configure something in journaling and I create a new journal rule, I'm creating this rule to apply to basically every hub transport role in my network. If I go to send connectors, again, I'm configuring these send connectors on an enterprise-wide scale here, so this is going to affect everything. Whereas if I go down into the server configuration instead of organizational and look at the things that I can configure on the mailbox or client access level, let's go into client access actually, If I configure Outlook Web Access on 3C Gmail 07, and I go ahead and get properties on the Outlook Web Access item here, and maybe I set authentication to allow forms-based authentication just using the username, and maybe I supply the logon domain here so that users don't actually have to do domain \username. That would be a configuration that's only going to take effect. It's actually going to take effect as soon as I restart the IIS. It's only going to take effect on the server that I selected. And then moving down into a smaller sphere, if I go down into recipient configuration, I can actually see recipients in my domain and configure particular ones. Now, I don't have a mailbox for Gandalf de Grey or for David Shackelford, and the reason why is because I created those users before I set up Exchange. But what I could go ahead and do here is create a new mailbox, and this is going to be a user mailbox. Notice there's all sorts of different kinds of mailboxes I could create here. Room mailboxes, just for room scheduling. Equipment, so it's going to be separate from rooms. This is kind of new because in the past you either had user mailboxes or you had everything else mailboxes, and now I've kind of broken things down a little bit. And then a linked mailbox, which is just used for a user who's not in this actual domain or forest to connect to, but we're actually going to let a user who's from a separate trusted forest connect to it. We're not going to have a lot of reason to talk about linked mailboxes for Cash Cow Capital Group, but these other three mailboxes, we'll cover all of those. So let's go ahead and on to the user mailbox. Because I'm going to create a mailbox for an existing user, myself, I'm going to go ahead and choose me and do next. And DShack is fine for an alias. And I'm going to leave these things unchecked for now. We'll look at some things like that later. I've got to pick a database. There's only one database available, so I'll select that. And we'll do a next. And I'm going to go ahead and click New. And notice that the task says it's completed, but one thing it also does is it gives us this kind of interesting information under here. You might say to yourself, what on earth is that? Well, that's actually the script that ran underneath to go ahead and create that mailbox. And notice this says select Control-C to copy the contents of this page. Interesting. We'll come back and refer to that a little bit later. And I want to go ahead and create a mailbox for Gandalf too. So I'm going to go ahead quickly through that. Choose User Mailbox. Choose an existing user. Let's go ahead and add Gandalf. And go ahead and do Next. I'm going to select the mailbox database that I want to create this mailbox in. And that's selected, so I'm going to go ahead next and finish up. Good. Now we're done. So now I've got three mailboxes here that I could administer. We will come back to that subject. We're just kind of cruising around, and I got a little carried away in our going through the spheres. But basically, typical task for the recipient sphere is exactly what we just did. Creating mailboxes, maybe disabling mailboxes, moving the mailbox to a different mailbox store, setting the send as permission to let another user send mail for Gandalf. Going into properties, show you what's here. Notice that we see a lot of things here that we would also see if we were in the Active Directory users and computers. We might see user information, address and phone number, organization. The fact is, all of this is information that is stored in the Active Directory. So changing any of these things is updating Active Directory. The fact is, most of these things are all going to be making changes to the Active Directory. So let's go ahead and get out of here. That's a subject that's going to come up soon for us, though. We can create a new distribution group, and now distribution groups in Exchange 2007 can be either standard distribution groups where you just pick the members of them and add them, or they can be dynamic, the results of a query. So you can go ahead and make a distribution group based on the membership of some different Active Directory user groups that you have, or on some other criteria. So maybe folks whose organization is a certain value or who live in a certain state based on information you've provided on that user's properties. We can create mail contacts. If you remember mail contacts, what they were in previous versions of Exchange, these are typically contacts that can show up in your address book but have external email addresses in them. So if I go ahead and do new mail contact, I can go ahead and create one. And I'm going to go ahead and put this contact in the users unit. And I'm going to call this contact Franz Kafka. So there's Franz and Kafka. We're going to give him an external email address. And we're going to call him, his email address is bug metamorphosis.net. And we'll set that and go ahead and continue. And that contact went ahead and got created. Notice that the script was fairly simple here. Create a new mail contact, give it an SMTP address, give it some names and a directory, an OU to throw it into, and we're done. And there's our mail contact. Disconnected mailboxes are mailboxes for users that we may have stripped a user of rights to have a mailbox and basically used a little digital axe to cut the connection between a user and the mailbox. Those mailboxes that have been disconnected from users will be here. Sometimes you want to delete a user, but you don't delete the mailbox. And that, again, that mailbox might be here. We might reconnect that mailbox to a new user if we wanted to. So those are some different things we would do here. Before we get too much further into the interface, I'd like to step back and look at architecture a bit. And to do that, we're going to move on to this architecture slide. So we have the Active Directory where changes are made. Just like when we looked in the recipients container, we were looking at some of those user or mailbox objects, and we saw that we could change organization and other information that we know is actually stored in the Active Directory. Some of the things that we do with the management console will actually make changes to the registry, the local registry of the server that we're configuring. And then lastly, some of the things that we change in the management console will affect the Exchange database itself, where Exchange stores all of its mailbox, public folder, and configuration information about connectors, things we've created there. Now notice that there's two ways of pushing changes into these locations, into the AD, the registry, and the Exchange databases. One of the means of doing that is by using the Exchange Management Console, where we were spending time a minute ago. The other way of making those changes is via the management shell, where we issue PowerShell commands, and we'll be covering this on the next video, PowerShell commands that go ahead and make those changes for us. Now the secret is that really, whether we're using the management console or the management shell, everything is really happening via PowerShell commands or special commandlets that have been written in PowerShell, which is a new programming language or scripting language, to make things happen, to configure the Exchange databases, to create registry entries, change registry entries, remove them, and to go ahead and submit information to the Active Directory, often to those new areas in the schema that we created when we first installed Exchange 2007. So I'll note this again. No matter what it is we do and how we do it, it's always being submitted to these areas using PowerShell. That's why when we were in the management console and we created new mailboxes or we created new mail-enabled contacts, it always showed us right before it executed, it showed us a little script. And basically it's saying, you've done this in the graphical user interface, but to make this really happen, I'm going to fire off this script that I've built for you to get this done. And the nice thing about those scripts, as I'll talk about in the next video, is you can copy them after you've kind of used the GUI to actually create the script. Copy them, paste them in Notepad or some other scripting tool that you like to use. And make edits, or even copy and paste a whole bunch of time, do find replaces, work with Excel, you name it, to build long scripts that can be fired off and make a whole bunch of changes at once, as opposed to having to do, in some cases, a lot of repetitive action in the management console to get things done. So that's architecture. As you can imagine, some of these areas really map to those three spheres of influence in the Exchange Management Console. Remember how we talked about organizational level changes that affect all Exchange servers? Chances are, most of the time, those changes are going to be made in the Active Directory. And all of the Exchange servers that get added will refer to the Active Directory for their marching orders and knowing how they're supposed to be configured in general. Say you make a change to a particular server. Maybe we went into that Outlook Web Access area under the server configuration like we did, and we changed the style of forms authentication to not have to provide the domain name like we did. That's actually going to be a registry change that was made. As you can well imagine, if I want to make a change that's just going to affect a single server, it's probably going to get stuck somewhere at HK local machine in the registry on that server. And then lastly, if I make a change to a user mailbox or configure recipients, that could either be a change that gets made to the Active Directory, depending on whether we're dealing with Active Directory object properties, or that could be a change that gets written to the Exchange database. There's no hard and fast rule for where changes are going to get made depending on organizational, server, and recipient level, but I've made some generalizations that are mostly true. That being said, what if I want to delegate permissions to an administrator and I want to only let them admin recipients, go in and change properties on a user, assign them to another office, give send as permissions to somebody? The way we're going to do that is really by going into Exchange Management under Organization Configuration. Notice we have a list of Exchange administrators. Now by default, the only people that are given these are some certain groups that are pre-existing. So if we bring this out, we see that there are the Exchange Organization admins, the public folder admins, the recipient admins, and then the local administrator. So if I put users into any of these groups, either organizations, public folders, or recipients, I could give them rights to admin the server. Another way to do this, though, which is going to be easier for me to know as an admin who's actually doing stuff, and hopefully I have a fairly short list of administrators, is just to click Add Exchange Administrator and look at this wizard we're walked through. So notice that I can create pick a user, and I'm going to pick myself in this case. Now I can choose what the role and scope is that I'm going to give David Shackelford. I can give him an organizational admin role. And as an organizational admin, I can actually do pretty much everything. I have read rights. Basically, I can access the domain user object, so I can go into recipients and get things done. I can go ahead and write to the Exchange schema in the Active Directory, which means I'm basically handling all organization level stuff. And I also own the server configuration, so I can go ahead and make changes that are going to write to the server registries. So basically I can control all three of those spheres. If I'm a public folder admin, yep, you got it. I do not have rights over the whole organization. I don't have rights over the specific server. I don't even have rights over the recipients, but I can go ahead and set permissions, set properties, do configuration, deletions, changes on public folders. If I look down at Exchange recipient administrators, this role actually has permissions to access the domain user objects in the Active Directory and make changes to them. I can also write to the Exchange schema on some level just to take care of recipient stuff, but I have no rights to configure the Exchange server and set things that are going to be typically written to the registry on that server. I really am focusing on the recipient role. I also can't go up into the organizational level and set broad organizational level things that are going to affect all the Exchange servers. View only lets me basically use the EMC to see how things are configured, but not change any configurations. And that's good for sometimes a help desk person who might want to go ahead and check on things and then recommend yes or no, this thing is set wrong, to actual server admins. And then we've got the Exchange Server Admin role. This is a user who does not have permission to change information about user objects in the Active Directory. They don't have permission to administer the Exchange organization, but they do have access to change specific server configurations. So they could have gone into that Outlook Web Access config that we did earlier, and they could have made that change. All right, that pretty much covers that. I'm going to go ahead and add myself to the Exchange administrator role. Notice that when I have this selected, I don't have a particular server that I can access, which is because this is an umbrella role. It should admin all of them. Whereas if I go to that one, same thing. I can admin all public folders. Recipients is all recipients. Same here. It's only the server admin that we pick a server that they can admin. So I'm going to pick that and go ahead and add myself and finish that up. So let's go ahead back to our setup here just to make sure we covered everything. So if I give out a role, I'm giving access to a specific sphere of configuration. Basically, the reason and the big difference in this way of assigning or delegating permissions as opposed to Exchange 2003 and earlier versions was there were a lot of things specifically that if you wanted to give someone the rights to administer recipients but not the rights to administer a server, you ended up having to go down into individual recipients and individual mailboxes, getting permissions on them and adding that particular user to the access control list or the ACL on that user's mailbox. And it was a real pain in the neck. It wasn't very obvious who the admins were, where they'd been given rights down inside the tree because they, you couldn't see at the top what they'd been given rights to. You had to drill down and check the security list on every object to find out if anyone had been added to that object or added to the security list on that object. And we talked about how the EMC is broken into spheres. So we're pretty much covered on that. What we're going to do next is a basic tour of the EMC. This tour is going to be a little bit more in-depth than the last quick tour we took because we're going to look at some of the finalization tasks that were on our list and take care of some of those. So let's go get to it. All right. Well, we've been here, but what we want to do is start going through the organizational configuration, starting with mailbox. Now there's really actually two distinct areas in here. One is these managed folders. That includes managed custom folders, managed default, and managed folder policies. I'm going to be covering those in a future video, but right now I'll just say that if these are the managed folders that you're normally used to seeing in Outlook 2007, for example, your inbox, your deleted items, your calendar contacts, the basic default stuff, managed custom folders lets you create new items that are going to be standard, new folders that can be standard across your enterprise. So if your company had to deal with records that were highly sensitive and you wanted to always have a certain folder that those were found in, you might create a custom folder called sensitive documents, and all sensitive documents would be in there. And what you could do is once that folder exists, you could actually go ahead and set some policies on it. Let's go ahead and quickly create this. Go ahead and set a policy on that by doing new managed content settings, which will, among other things, let us configure journaling for it, which is essentially archiving or sending a copy of it to another location, whether that's another user mailbox or whether that's basically to a public folder somewhere. Let's go ahead and set that. I'm going to call this content expiration. And notice that right here in the intro, I can actually set the retention period. I'm going to make this a documents type folder. And I'm going to go ahead and say that the retention period starts when the items move to the folder. And at the end of the retention period, we're going to go ahead and do a permanent delete. And that's going to be the, okay, retention age limit must be specified. Let's go ahead and say that the retention limit is going to be 30 days. There we go. Journaling, forward copies of anything that goes into this folder somewhere else. Normally we would set this, and we might set a central mailbox that would be tied into maybe some third-party archiving product like a Quest's Exchange Archiver or GFI's Mail Archiver. On this next page is just a confirmation of what we're doing, and we go ahead and click Finish. And now we've got not only a managed custom folder, we can assign this this folder called Sensitive Docs to appear in everyone's Outlook, and we've got a content expiration policy setting attached to it. So we've talked about the managed default ones. We've talked about the custom we can create. If we want to create multiple custom folders and then assign them to mailboxes, we can do that through a managed folder mailbox policy. And I'm going to go ahead and call this sensitive and add the sensitive docs folder to it and click next. And now I have a mailbox policy. If I go ahead and look at that policy, I've got that configured there. I can go ahead and apply this policy in other places to different groups of users to make sure that they have it. Okay, the other thing that comes up in this mailbox tool is basically about address lists. We can create custom address lists. We could go ahead and create a, let's do one right now. Let's see here, new address list. I can name this address list, let's call it Vapor Analysts, because I have a special selection group made of these folks. So I'm going to go ahead and continue here. And I'm going to go ahead and say that people who are members of this department are now going to be added to a special address list or address book called Vapor Analysis, address list called Vapor Analysis. And we're going to go ahead and apply that address list immediately. And now we've got this Vapor Analysts special address list. If we go ahead and look in that address list, it's not really going to show us the contents. It's just going to show us what the criteria are to create it. But a user will be able to go ahead and look at that later. Now, while your back was turned, I went ahead and created a bunch more recipients in our Active Directory with mailboxes. And I set the properties on some of them to be members of the Vapor Analysts department. So later on we'll go ahead and we'll notice that address list that will be populated. The other type of address list is the offline address book. There is a default one. This is an address book that clients using Outlook on laptops that go offline take with them. These are address books that users using Outlook Anywhere can download. One of the things that is in the, let's see here, the finalization of deployment is to go ahead and configure the offline address book. And so we're going to go ahead and do that. Two things. We need to set it up to be distributed, and we need to go ahead and make it available for Outlook 2003 clients. So we're going to go back in here, get properties on offline address book, and go to distribution. Now it's already checked this box here to enable web-based distribution, so we don't need to check that again. And it's being provided to the world through the OAB subpiece of the default website. Now we don't usually ever need to go there manually. It's something that Outlook automatically knows to look for, and it's published to all the clients. So there's no space here for us to type in an actual domain name or anything. We also have our client support settings here, letting us choose which versions of Outlook we're going to support. In this situation, we're going to go ahead and support all the way back to Outlook 98, Service Pack 2 or later. And we're also going to include Outlook 2003, Service Pack 2 or later. But I believe this one actually takes us all the way up to this point, and then this one brings us all the way up to regularly up to Outlook 2007. So, as far as address list, by default the offline address book is only going to hold the default global address list, but we could go ahead and add, for example, the vapor analysis address list to the default offline address list. And the general tab here basically just sets us up for our scheduling. We're going to update at 5 a.m., usually a good time. It's the default, but we might want it to run more often than that. If so, we might want to set a custom schedule and maybe have it updating every 15 minutes, something like that. But the default setting is usually good enough. So that's what's going on in the organizational mailbox level. Under client access, we really only have one thing. We have an active sync mailbox policy. Exchange active sync is basically the mechanism used to allow PDAs, Windows mobile devices, go ahead and connect to an Exchange server and download mail, contacts, address books, even browse file shares and SharePoint resources within the network remotely from a PDA. If we go ahead and get properties on this, we'll see some of these things. We're not going to go in depth on all of these settings, but notice right off the bat we've got Windows SharePoint services and Universal Name Convention or UNC access to basically Windows file shares, that's UNC paths, and Windows SharePoint services. By default, both of those are allowed. Password settings, what kind of settings are we requiring that the user use out on their device there? By default, we're not requiring one. This is a different password than the domain password. This is a password that's set out on the active sync, out on the PDA, so we're not worrying about that. Sync settings, what sorts of things are we going to go ahead and sync up? Are we going to limit message sizes? Are we going to allow synchronization of HTML formatted email or not? And we can set max attachment sizes. So lots of settings on the device. Under advanced, we can choose applications that we're letting to be run, others that we're going to block. This is not so much just about controlling how mail is provided to the PDAs. This is kind of extending active sync to have a lot more control over the remote device than just handing off mail contacts in the settings. This kind of integrates tightly with Windows Mobile operating system, and basically it's a way to administer those devices. Moving on to hub transport, we've got several different areas here. The first area we're going to talk about is email address policies. This is where we choose what email addresses users are going to have on their end. By default, if we look at this policy, we're going to see that, if we just move straight on into email addresses, every user is going to be given a 3cg.local email address. And that's not going to be sufficient for us. We've got to add a couple. So what we're going to do is we're going to add, let's go ahead and add 3cg, no, we're going to add cash cow capital group. .com, and that looks good. And we're also going to add check dormbo.com. Remember that? That was the old domain that that we're transitioning off of for this company. When we're setting up this new server, we're going to make sure that they can still receive mail to those aliases. So we're going to go ahead and add that domain as well. And we're pretty much done with that screen. Let's go ahead. Actually, one thing we want to do is we want to set cash cow capital group to be the reply address for everyone. Or really, it's kind of setting it as the default email address. So we're going ahead and setting that. And we're going to go ahead and have this policy of apply now. Go ahead with that. Okay. This lets us know the order in which we should be taking care of these things. Because we don't have Cash Cow Capital Group as an accepted domain, we can't actually set it in the policy. So we need to go over to accepted domains. And right now there's only one domain that's accepted. That's 3cg.local. We're going to add a couple of them. We're going to add Cash Cow, and we'll call this Cash Cow Capital Group. I'm going to go ahead and add that in at the top too, actually. And it's going to be an authoritative domain, basically saying that really this is the where the buck stops as far as this domain and recipients go. So we've got that created. We're going to also go ahead and create the check dorm bro, and we'll call this legacy address. checkdormbro.com. All right, and now we can actually go ahead to email address policies, edit that, go on in, and go ahead and add Cash Cow Capital Group.com. And we'll also go ahead and add checkdormbo.com. Go ahead and finish that. Apply these changes immediately. And now we're done. And the one thing we forgot to do in here, let's go ahead and set one of those addresses to be the reply address. And we'll get out. And what I'd like us to do now is I'm going to jump down to mailboxes. I'm going to open up my mailbox. And I'm going to look at email addresses. Notice that I've got all three of those settings now as possible email addresses. And the one that I'd set here, dshak@cashcowcapitalgroup.com, is now set to be my reply address. Notice that this box is checked saying automatically update email addresses based on email address policy. If I wanted to make this address my reply, I could uncheck that, set that as my reply, and from now on, even if I change settings over where I was before in the default email address policy, the change would not be reflected here as far as which my default reply address was. I'm going to go ahead and set that and set this one back as my reply. Apply that. Okay, it's all right. I hadn't clicked OK before anyway, so no changes really happened. So heading back to client access. We're done there. Actually, we were over at Hub Transport. I'm going to look at transport rules now. Transport rules are really about things that I would like to have happen to each email that comes in or goes out of this domain. So this is a place where we do a lot of different things. One of the things we can do here is we can add a disclaimer to the bottom of an email or even to the beginning of an email. So I might say disclaimer might be my name for this transport rule. And I'm going to go ahead and say when this mail is sent to, let's go ahead and send it to users, not inside. We're going to change this to outside the organization. When this email is sent to users outside the organization, we are going to append disclaimer text. And the disclaimer text that we're going to append is, please know that this email is confidential and should only be read by the intended recipient. Okay, so that's pretty simple, but that's just an example. Notice that we could create transport rules to do all sorts of things. We could choose mail that was came in from a certain domain, and we could set the spam confidence level to something, which would basically allow us to bypass a filter that we'd set up for mail from another company. We could add a recipient to the blind carbon copy of every email that came in from a certain user. So you could use transport rules to really do all sorts of things that people have wanted to do for a long time and maybe should or shouldn't have been allowed to do. For example, if there was some sort of uh, inter-employee warfare going on where people were sending harassing emails, but maybe that user was deleting the item from their own sent items, and the user who'd received it had also deleted it too, but there needed to be some proof in the future, regardless of whether either user deleted something, that the thing still existed. You could blind carbon copy copies of mail from those two people to a separate or third, maybe the HR department or something like that. Um, Silently drop messages from certain individuals. Say someone left the company and they've been causing trouble by sending emails back to different employees there. You could set up a transport rule that would silently drop messages from them. Anyway, we've gone ahead and set the disclaimer. Are there any exceptions? Let's say we could say except when the message is sent to our sister company, for example. You could set that. We're not going to do that right now. And basically here we are. We've just set up that transport disclaimer. And now we've got that disclaimer. So we can set transport rules. This is a pretty broad brush tool you can use for all sorts of things. Journaling we talked about a little bit. If we want mail from all users or just some users, depending on whether we set this here, to be sent to a particular email address, a journaling account is typically what we call it. We could set that up here. I'm not going to do this because we will cover archiving later. We talked about accepted domains, remote domains. By default, all domains are considered remote domains. Let's look at the default remote domain, see what's applied. Note that basically there's two things that are covered here. How out-of-office messages, or OOF message types, are handled, and how message format is taken care of. Message format is basically whether we're going to allow rich text to be used, how MIME is going to be handled, and then out of office, by default, we're allowing out of office messages that are marked as external. Later on, we'll look at the difference between external and internal out of office messages. Some of this has to do with how things are set up on the client themselves. By default, we are allowing those out. And message format, whether we're going to allow automatic replies and automatic forwards, etc. So what is all this for? Well, if you had a domain, a particular domain that you had a lot of email going back and forth from, and there were complaints about the way things were handled, maybe rich text didn't always come across the way you wanted it to, or you're having issues with their MIME character set, like we do maybe between offices. We've got a lot of folks in our Czech office with Cash Cow Capital Group mailing folks in Europe, and they're using different character sets for MIME. Being able to configure these on a domain-by-domain basis could be handy. So we're not going to set those up right now, but just want to let you know what those things are. So we've looked at accepted domain, transport rules. One thing we haven't looked at are these three. Send connectors are basically special funnels. There's a default send connector that we don't actually see, but we can build custom send connectors. Say I wanted to send mail securely out to the FCC. So I could call this FCC, and this is go ahead and going to be a partner send connector. Actually, no, it's not. Let's see here. Let's say partner. There we go. Basically, because it's a partner, and basically this is when you have two ends that are both wanting to use TLS certificates to encrypt the traffic, you might set this up. You could add an address space and say all mail going to fcc.us.gov would go through this connector. And I'm going to go ahead and use public DNS to go ahead and do that. And this is going to be the hub server that I'm going to associate this send connector with. And I'm basically go ahead and finish this up. Depending on the role you pick, the partner role we chose was all about encryption. You basically set up custom ways to communicate with remote mail servers. And typically the most common usage for this is to set up TLS encryption like we just did very briefly. We'll come back to this in another video. Edge subscriptions, if you do have an Edge server deployed, then this is where you're going to look at the Edge servers that you have deployed. And you're going to go ahead and be able to configure some of those subscriptions. And then lastly, global settings. There is a default global transport settings configured. If we look at properties on that, we see two different types of things. We see max send and receive size, max send size. So this is where I would set all of our max limits for send and receive and the number of recipients for our entire Exchange organization. Because remember, we're still up here in the organization sphere. And the transport dumpster, how large are we going to make our trash can before that sort of stuff gets dumped out? We're going to try to keep things in there for 7 days, and the maximum size is going to be 18 megs. Message delivery, do we have internal SMTP servers? For example, you might have a SharePoint server internally or some sort of custom application that sends mail to your Exchange server, and you may not want those emails to be filtered, to have sender ID and connection filtering applied to those. So you would add the IP addresses of each internal server that might be sending SMTP mail directly to the system from the inside network. That would be how you take care of that. This is about configuring custom DSNs, or basically we know them as the errors that you get when mail bounces or something's wrong with mail. Let you go ahead and edit these. We're not going to mess with those there. Anyway, that's that. We've pretty much covered the things under hub transport. We're not going to be talking about unified messaging in this class or in this video series, so we're going to generally skip those. Going down into server configuration. If we click on the root of server configuration, we're going to see all of our servers. And for each server we have, we're going to see what roles it currently is holding. If I right-click on that server and I say, hey, I want to manage the mailbox server role, it's basically just going to jump me down into that area of server config. It's going to have that server selected from the list, and it's going to go ahead and show me the information related to that item. So on a server, when we configure mailboxes, we basically are looking at storage groups and databases. So if we go to storage group and get properties, we don't see a whole lot here. We see log files, we see how logging is being handled. We'll talk about circular logging later. It's actually when we go down into the database, when we dismount, change the path, go into properties, that's where we can do a bit more. We can set up a journal recipient for all things that happen on this database. We can choose to allow this database to be overwritten by a restore. That's what you normally check before you run a restore process against this database to recover it. We can set our limits here for how large a mailbox is allowed to get before we lock things down, when the warning messages should be sent out, how long messages should be retained after they're deleted, how long we should hold on to a mailbox after we've deleted the mailbox to give us a chance to reconnect it to a user if we need to. And then moving on to client settings, do we have an offline address book configured? I'm going to go ahead and check that one. And where's our default public folder database? It's in the second storage group. So here we see our second storage group with the public folder database. What's the difference between a mailbox database and a public folder as far as what they look like in properties? Well, you can take a look. One thing we don't see is the same circular, actually, let me show you the difference. Let's go back here. We don't see the journal recipient, and some of the maintenance schedule and client settings things are different. We have a few more options with public folder databases because we bring replication into the mix. Public folder stores, unlike mailboxes can really only be located in a single mailbox store without clustering being configured. Public folder databases, on the other hand, are kind of more like, maybe if you're familiar with DFS or with other technologies that replicate, we can keep replicas of a public folder database on multiple servers that are running or wearing the mailbox role hat. We're going to come back to this later, just to let you know that it's there. Moving down into client access, we see again we can choose our server up here, and we've got 4 tabs to configure. POP3 and IMAP, we can pick either one of these and configure the ports that are being listened on for the server. Pick the IP addresses that the server is using to listen in those ports, as you can tell. Choose the authentication level. We're requiring TLS for IMAP 4, but you could allow plain text. Just different timeout settings and information about retrieval. IMAP, these are some sort of things you need to set up when you are configuring IMAP, so here they are. And we've got the POP3 settings as well. We're not going to go kind of deep, but a lot of the same sorts of things. Offline address book distribution. We configured the offline address book, but here is where you actually go ahead and set an actual URL for that. Right now, by default, the internal URL is set such and such. The external URL, we'd probably end up setting it to something like HTTP, cowmail. Remember how we used that address on the outside? Cash cow capital group.com/OAB. We're going to have to set the pieces of inside to make that properly work later, but we'll go ahead and set that for now. And in addition to that distribution, we've got Outlook Web Access to configure. We were already in here a bit earlier and we looked at authentication. Notice that we've got that URL to set as well here. I'm going to go ahead and set this. Whoops, let's go ahead and set that HTTPS. Cowmail, cash cow capital group.com/OA. Apply that. And under authentication, we've talked a little bit about forms-based authentication. We'll be covering all of these things a lot more later. This whole tab is about how we can allow access through OA to internal shares via SharePoint or a regular UNC paths or normal server shares. A bit more information about that and more here. And next we'll look at Exchange ActiveSync. This is the ActiveSync website. What's the actual path going to be? I'm going to go ahead and copy that path and publish it here and make this change to cowmail.cashcowcapitalgroup.com. And notice you've got authentication here, whether to use certificates, require them or not. This is actually all about client-side certificates, and for the most part we always ignore client-side. What we care about with ActiveSync is the server-side certificate. And then remote file servers, we talked about this before, the ability to go ahead and access resources in the internal network. So that pretty much covers it for client access pieces. We'll go actually in depth on another video. Hub transport, basically we have receive connectors, and just to take a quick look at one, when a remote mail server connects to our server, what's the name that our server is going to spit out in response to its initial connection. And I think we're going to set this to actually be cowmail.cashCowCapital group.com and apply that. And as far as network, we set the listening IP address, whether we're going to allow servers that want to encrypt their communication with our server to do so, and we are. We're not enforcing it, but we're allowing it to take place. And permission groups. Who's going to be allowed to connect to using this? Exchange users for now is set up. And that's pretty much it for server configuration. What we're going to do next is move on down to recipient configuration. We've really covered mailbox already. Distribution groups, we can create a real quick distribution group here and call this group. Actually, here's a rule of thumb for you. Security groups do everything that distribution groups do, but they also allow you to set permissions on things in other contexts. So it's actually more efficient in general to use security groups whenever you can. So for this, I'm going to call this distribution group fax readers. And I've created the group. What I need to do now is go ahead and give it some members. So I'm going to go ahead and add John Smallberries and Mark Helprin, and let's put Sayers in there as well. Go ahead and apply that. We're not going to go in depth on this the rest of the way, just because we will be coming back. But a lot of those tabs in there should be familiar to you, at least email addresses, being able to set an email address on an actual distribution group so that people on the outside can send mail to that address, and then all the folks in that group will get those mails. Notice under recipient configuration, we don't have the same exact items, mailbox, client access, hub transport. We have mailbox, distribution group, mail contact. We've talked about contacts before when we created a mail-enabled contact for Franz Kafka. And we talked about disconnected mailboxes. That pretty much takes us through our tour here. The only other thing I wanted to talk about, and it's next on our roster, is to look at the toolbox. So let's go back in and look at what we can see there. In the toolbox, we see an old friend, the Best Practices Analyzer. Details templates are essentially a way to manage the view that a user has when they go into different parts of the user interface. Say a user opens up an address list, you can configure how those items are displayed, what language is used by default to display them, all sorts of different options related to that. That's not something we're going to cover, but just want to let you know what that basically was. It's kind of cryptic. As far as the public folder management console, this is where we go ahead and administer all of our public folders. We are not going to go into it deeply right now. I'm going to go ahead and connect to the local server, and I'll show you the basic view, but then we're going to go ahead and jump out of this. So let's OK that and connect. Notice that I can see default public folders and system public folders. Right now, we don't have any actual public folders. We could easily create one, but we're not going to do that right now. Let's jump back out. The next item is disaster recovery management. These two tools are to help you figure out what to do when your information store won't mount. Basically, there's some real smart automatic checking that is done by the troubleshooter and through the recovery management console to make it so you don't have to spend a lot of time at the command line running ESE util and other scripts like that to find out what the actual state of a database is. Some of the a lot of that lifting and minutia that we had to do in previous versions of Exchange has kind of been taken off of our hands and wizardized through these tools. So as far as mail flow tools go, we've got message tracking, which was in the old Exchange 2000 interface. You remember that one. if you use that. It's going to be separated out into this toolbox as its own tool. Basically, the Mailflow Troubleshooter along with message tracking is a good way to find out what's really going on with mail that's either coming in and not being routed properly, or it's going out and you're encountering problems when your server tries to communicate with a specific remote server. You could use this troubleshooter to track down that problem. We will be covering transport troubleshooting later on. So again, this is just a high-level overview. The queue viewer, you used to see this not in the mailbox, I'm sorry, not in a toolbox in the old interface. It was kind of right up under the server. But this is how you view queues. If we look at queues right now, you're not going to see much because we're not really up and ready for action. But you basically are going to see your list, see domains, what the current status is, how many messages are in that actual specific queue instance. Routing log basically is just kind of hand in hand with message tracking and queue viewing, finding out how, this is actually for troubleshooting how mail is being routed within your organization. Typically a large organization when you might have multiple mailbox servers and multiple hub transports. And lastly, to close up, we've got performance monitor, which is basically same old performance monitor we've used in the past, but this one's kind of an enhanced because it kind of knows ahead of time the counters that we're most likely to want to look at when we're using Exchange 2007. So we don't have to research all of these special counters and objects to be able to get a good read on what's going on with our server. And performance troubleshooter, this is basically a place you'd come to go through a wizard that would help you identify bottlenecks in your system. So that kind of wraps it up for tools that are integrated. There are always additional tools on Microsoft's website. If you go to, let me type it in there, Microsoft.com/exchange. If you go to the Exchange site and go to Downloads, and turn off that filter, go to Actual Tools, you'll notice several tools. We're not going to talk about the anti-spam migration right now, but the ones I'm thinking of showing you are Jet Stress, specifically for putting a lot of pressure or stress on your disk subsystem to see how it performs. The same sort of stress that an Exchange server might put on it. Notice that for all the tools I'm going to talk about here, you've got both the 64-bit and the 32-bit. So you can cause that stress to happen using a 32-bit tool on your workstation, pointing it at a server that's 64-bit. We've also got the Exchange load generator, which pretty much is going to show you what your server is going to look like perhaps in the future when you've got your predicted growth going on, so you can decide ahead of time whether it might be a good idea to eliminate bottlenecks. Maybe you need more RAM. Maybe you realize, look, with where we're going to be in a year, doesn't look like our disks are really going to handle this sort of traffic. We'd like to stop using a mirror for our database and actually put it on a 6-spindle RAID 5 array. Server stress and performance is kind of right along with load generator, but it basically will show you what happens when you really are pounding a server with a lot of specific client connections. It's more specific to creating stress than generally the load generator is. And then lastly, the server profile analyzer. You might run the analyzer on each server in kind of an enterprise environment and decide, look, based on these statistics, we may not want to add any more users to the mailbox store on that server. We may want to start putting new mailboxes on this other server with its information store, mailbox store, just to distribute the load a bit. And the server profile analyzer would give you the information that you might need to make those calls. All right, that's pretty much it for tools. Let's head back to our OneNote and see if there's anything we've left off. Yes, there is. All right, there is a 32-bit edition, It was created around the same time that the 64-bit was written, mainly just for use in evaluation to allow people to see the features that were on the 64-bit, to basically allow a lot of the early adopters and beta testers to run it on 32-bit hardware, just to test it, test basic functionality without needing to have all the extra hardware. It's currently used in classrooms, in labs, in non-production environments. It's useful for a few different things. For one, we talked about the ability to run setup with the AD prep switches from a system that was not a 64-bit system using the 32-bit version of Exchange 2007. Yes, you could do that. You could download the 32-bit edition, and I'll show you how to do that in a sec. You could run setup with a switch, even on a workstation or some system that was not going to be the destination server. And you could go ahead and update the Active Directory schema using the 32-bit edition. As 32-bit, so what's the difference between 32-bit and 64-bit? Well, if you haven't figured it out by now, 32-bit does not have the ability to address nearly as much memory as a 64-bit version would. And it's going to have to run on 32-bit hardware. You could technically run a 32-bit version of Exchange on 64-bit hardware, but why would you do that? 64-bit will run it as a backward compatibility feature within kind of its own virtual 32-bit machine, but it's not going to be the way you want to do things. As far as where to get it, we're going to go to Microsoft's website real quick and grab it. Basically, it's just known as the Evaluation Edition. So if we go to microsoft.com/exchange and go into downloads, again, like we just were a minute ago, one of the items you can see in downloads is the evaluation server, the evaluation software for Exchange 2007 server. They've also got it here, register to download the Exchange 2007 eval software. It's kind of a hassle to go through that registration, so I'm not going to do it right now. But basically you end up downloading the 32-bit edition. One reason why people were downloading that edition was because it came with 32-bit tools. So they could download the 32-bit edition, install just the tools on a workstation. But now that's not necessary because we've got the 32-bit Exchange 2007 server management tools as a separate possible download. So this is going to be a good thing to do. I'm going to go ahead and download these tools right now to install on this workstation. And I'm not going to go all the way through that install right this second. And it looks like I've already actually downloaded it, so we'll run that in a minute. But I wanted to let you know where to get it, what its limitations are. Some versions of the eval, I think eval has been switched from being a non-expiring eval to being a 120-day eval, especially now that the tools, the 32-bit tools, are being provided separately from it. And my point on how to use it for management ease is really all about installing those 32-bit tools, so I don't have a lot to offer beyond that. So the next video we're going to look at is going to be the video that covers the Exchange Management Shell. But in the meantime, we've covered quite a bit here. We really didn't fly as high as we wanted to when we were going on our tour of the Exchange Management Console. We did cover a lot of ground there. It took care of a lot of little tasks that we would have had to come back to later. We talked about architecture, whether we use the console or the shell. Everything ends up using a PowerShell commandlet to make changes to each of the three locations that store Exchange-related info, whether it's the AD, the registry, or the Exchange database. We talked about role delegation, and we walked through how to do that, how to give someone the ability to go ahead and just administer recipients or just configure the server and not do other things. along those lines, pretty much what they're calling this new system is a split permission system where you can assign someone Exchange admin rights without necessarily giving them also the keys to the whole Active Directory. So pretty much that covers it. We talked about the tools in the 32-bit edition. Let's go ahead and move on to talking a bit about PowerShell.